So now it's time to start sewing our quilt top together. This is when all the magic happens. So I've got all my pieces cut out. I went ahead and cut the other pieces off camera. So now I'm going to talk about sewing pieces together. So here I've got my two pieces that make up that top third of the quilt. And we're going to place them right sides together. Right sides together is like the golden rule of sewing, with the exception of some fancy techniques, but for the most part, just always double check. I know the blue might be hard to see which side is the right side, but just always want your two right sides of your fabrics facing each other. Line them up nice and evenly along the edge, and we're gonna pin them together all along the edge that we're gonna be sewing. So I always place my pins perpendicular to the seam that I'm going to be sewing, with the heads facing out to the right so that I can pull them out with my right hand as I sew. What you do not want to do is pin like this, because when you're sewing, you're going to stab yourself right in the hand with the pin. You're not going to be happy because you don't want to get blood on your fabric. So you always want to pin this way. I'm going to pin about every 3 inches or so. If you're a beginner, just load it up with a lot of pins, because more pins make everything more stable. And if you're a more experienced sewer, you may only need a few pins, but you want to space them out about every few inches. Okay, now that we've pinned our fabric, we're ready to start sewing. So again, I'm using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. I planned that out when I was cutting, so I just need to remind myself to make sure I stick with that. So I'm just going to begin at the very top corner. I get a lot of questions in my sewing classes about why I don't backstitch a lot. I usually don't bother backstitching unless I'm sewing a seam that I know is a final seam. For any sort of construction seams in the middle of a project, I just usually don't bother, but that's just me. If you're in the habit of backstitching, by all means, just go ahead and backstitch whenever you want. It really never hurts to backstitch, unless you think it's a seam that you might have to tear out again later, but for the most part, just go for it. All right, there's our first seam, and I'm just going to trim my threads. I highly recommend getting into the habit of trimming your threads on every single seam. Don't wait until the end, because they can just get tangled in other seams as you go, so trim as you go. All right, so now I'm going to press this seam. Now in quilting, you generally always press your seams to the side, so one side or the other. In some other types of sewing, you might press the seam open, but in this case, we're going to press to the side. And my rule of thumb is that I always press toward the dark color, because when you turn the piece over, if you've pressed the seam allowance toward the light color, you might see that through the light color. So I always go toward the dark color, just as a little safety measure. And you just want to make sure that your two pieces of fabric are sort of pulled apart as you press them, that they're not folding together on each other. So I always press from one side and then flip it over, press from the other side, and give it some seam. And now we call this pressing in sewing, because you really want to just hold the iron in place. You don't want to kind of move it all over the place like you might do when you're ironing a piece of clothing. You just want to kind of press in one place and then move to the next place, because if you move the iron all over a lot, it actually can kind of stretch or distort your fabric a little bit. So this is good to go, and now we're ready to sew it to the next piece. So we've got a couple of pieces that are seamed, and now we're going to sew those together. So I'm going to go back to my piece which I sewed earlier. This is kind of the bottom section of the quilt. I'm going to place this right side up, and then I'm going to take my other piece, which needs to be oriented like this when they're sewn together. I think a lot of people have trouble kind of visualizing how to assemble things, whether it's a quilt or a garment that you're sewing. What I always do is kind of lay it out the way it needs to be and then flip it. So right now I'm just like, all right, this looks like my design. I know that everything's good. I haven't accidentally turned anything upside down. So now I'm going to flip them so that they're right sides together. And if you ever get confused, what I always do is imagine where I'm going to sew. So here's where I'm going to sew. I just sort of hold my finger there and open it up a little bit and just double check to make sure that everything is situated the way it should be. So now I'm going to align my two edges that I need to sew. I'm just going to spin this because I usually like to work with everything kind of in front of me vertically. and it's easier to reach. Now at this point, you may have a little unevenness. It may be that when you sewed your pieces together, you got a little bit of a jog with your fabrics. That is so normal. It happens to the best of us. The fabrics can shift a little bit when they're running through the machine. That's why you want to pin a lot, but sometimes even with a lot of pinning, depending on the fabric that you're using, you might get a little shifting. So first of all, don't stress about it. If it's a lot of shifting, you can maybe just trim off the uneven piece. Or you can just go ahead and pin them together and sew it, and all that unevenness will just be hidden inside your seam allowance. So don't freak out about that. We're just going to line our two pieces together here. We're going to pin them all the way. And I would suggest using a lot of pins on this because this is a long piece. And when you're sewing really long pieces of fabric together, there's just kind of a lot more real estate where that shifting can happen. Sewing a long piece is harder to keep accurate than sewing a little short piece. So just go ahead and be liberal with your pins. It won't hurt. Remember, you want to put them perpendicular to the edge you're going to be sewing with the head of the pin facing out to the right. So you really can use kind of any medium-sized pin. If you really go out and look at the pin selection in the stores, you might see some really tiny pins. Those are made for very fine fabrics like silks. You might see some really large, long pins. I like to use these kind of medium-sized ones with the medium-sized heads. I think technically quilters tend to use smaller pins, but personally I find these to just be a really good all-purpose pin, and I use them for everything. So it's not really that important of a thing. You can use almost any kind of pin that you have around, but when in doubt, just go for the medium size. That's kind of my rule of thumb for everything in life, actually. All right, it's time to sew this seam. So we're just gonna zip all the way down here. All right, so again, we're just sewing with a 1/4 inch seam allowance all the way down this side. This is my favorite moment because it's the last seam before the quilt top is completed. So it's going to be very excited to open it up after this and see how it looks. Now you might notice I'm getting a slight bubble in my fabric here as I'm sewing. That's a very normal thing. That's just because of the way the fabric feeds through the machine. You sometimes get a little bit of drag. So you can just kind of try to ease that in as you sew. And easing means to just gently coax the fabric where you want it to be. You don't want to force it so much that you get a pucker in your fabric. Just kind of gently encouraging it to smooth out as we sew. Now here I'm coming across a previous seam from another bit of the patchwork. I just want to make sure that as I sew over this, I don't accidentally flip it back because that could create a little bump in the quilt. So I'm just going to make sure that it lays in the position it's supposed to. Now see how it's kind of crinkling up under there. I'm just going to raise my presser foot and smooth it out underneath and keep going. Again, I'm getting a little bit of bubbling here, so I'm just sort of easing as I go. All right, it's time to iron this piece. So again, I'm just going to press the seam toward the darker fabric. And again, I sort of pull the fabric gently as I press it, and that just helps to make sure that the two pieces of fabric are fully flat and that they're not folded in at all. I hit it with a little bit of steam whenever I get to one of these intersection points, because that just helps those to really lay flat. The iron is on the highest setting, which is the cotton and wool setting, and that's because this is a cotton fabric and it can take the heat, and we really want to hit these seams with as much heat and steam as we can so that they'll be nice and flat. So go ahead and crank your iron up all the way. And again, I'm steaming it on the right side. And it really does make a difference to press your seams from the wrong side and the right side. It's not just an extra step, it really makes them look a lot nicer. All right, here's our quilt top. It's done. That was really quick, right? So now we're just gonna check and see if there's anything we need to trim. I've got some unevenness over here. That's really normal. Don't freak out about it. I'm just gonna start by kind of lining my quilt back up on the cutting mat, checking my grid, and then I'm just gonna trim off this piece that's extending over here. That happens for a lot of reasons. Maybe I was being a little sloppy when I was cutting and I just cut this piece 1/4 inch too big. Maybe I got distracted and had a seam allowance that was a little inconsistent. It's okay. Just roll with it. It'll be fine. All right. I think our quilt top is ready. It's looking good. Very simple, but very colorful and modern and graphic. I'm liking it. So now it's time to make our quilt sandwich.